Chapter 1. The drive out. Brian Lerner had always believed that nerves should be reserved for things that actually mattered, like a dog under anesthesia whose pulse dipped just a little too low, or a horse that decided halfway through a routine exam that it no longer believed in human authority. Those were reasonable situations for anxiety. Meeting his girlfriend's parents did not make the list. And yet, as he guided his aging but meticulously maintained sedan along the gentle curve of the two-lane road that led toward Sandy's hometown, he could feel something tight and persistent sitting just under his ribs. It wasn't fear. He kept telling himself that. Sandy sat in the passenger seat, her feet tucked beneath her, one hand idly tracing shapes on the fogged corner of the window from her iced coffee. She seemed, annoyingly, completely at ease. "You're quiet," she said finally, glancing sideways at him. "I'm driving," Brian replied. "You've been driving for an hour. You talked more when we were stuck behind that tractor." "I had strong opinions about that tractor." Sandy smiled faintly. "You always have strong opinions." "That's not true. You once gave a 10-minute speech about the ethical implications of novelty dog sweaters." "That was a discussion," he corrected. "And they're exploitative." "They're adorable," Sandy said. "They are emotionally manipulative." She laughed softly, and the sound eased something in his chest, though it didn't entirely dislodge it. "Okay," she said. "So you're not nervous?" "No. Not even a little?" Brian kept his eyes on the road. The trees lining the highway were growing more symmetrical, more curated, like even the foliage knew it was approaching wealth. "I didn't say that." Sandy lifted an eyebrow. "Oh? What did you say, exactly?" "I said I'm not nervous about meeting your parents." "And what are you nervous about?" He hesitated, drumming his fingers lightly against the steering wheel. "Context," he said finally. Sandy blinked. "Context? Yeah. Yours is different from mine." She tilted her head, watching him more closely now. "You mean money?" "I mean expectations," he said. "Money just happens to fund most of those. They're not going to, like, inspect your bank account." "I wouldn't put it past them," Brian muttered. "Brian, I'm kidding." He paused, then added, "Mostly." Sandy sighed, though there was a smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. "You're overthinking this." "I'm not. I'm accurately thinking it." "There's no such thing as accurately thinking," she said. "That's just your anxiety wearing a suit and pretending it's a rational person." Brian huffed. "I don't have anxiety." "You absolutely do. I have situational awareness. You have a mental spreadsheet of worst-case scenarios." "They're not worst-case," he said. "They're statistically plausible outcomes." Sandy leaned back in her seat and folded her arms. "Okay," she said. "What's the statistically plausible outcome here?" Brian considered it for a moment. "Your father asks probing questions that aren't really questions. Your mother evaluates me like she's mentally comparing me to someone else. I say something that is technically honest but not socially strategic. No one laughs. You get uncomfortable. I get irritated. Your father gets condescending. Then we all pretend everything's fine while slowly hating each other." There was a beat of silence. "Well," Sandy said, "that was vivid. I've thought about it. I can tell. But it's fine," he added, "because I'm not going to pretend to be someone else." "I don't want you to," she said quickly. "Good," Brian said, "because I'm bad at it." Sandy studied him for a moment, something softer entering her expression. "You know my parents aren't villains, right?" "I didn't say they were. You made them sound like they belong in a courtroom drama." "People with money sometimes act like they're cross-examining the world," he said. "It's not personal. It's just how they're used to interacting." She sighed. "You've already decided who they are." "I've made an educated guess." "Well," she said, turning back toward the window, "maybe try being open to the possibility of being wrong." Brian nodded slowly. "That would be nice." "Good. But I won't count on it." Sandy groaned. "You're impossible." "I'm consistent." "That's not the same thing." "It overlaps," he said. They fell into a quieter rhythm after that, the hum of the road filling the space between them. The town shifted subtly around them as they drove. Fewer gas stations, more manicured lawns. Fewer modest homes, more properties that seemed to expand outward just to prove they could. By the time they turned onto her parents' street, the houses had become estates, each one set back from the road as though they required distance in order to be fully appreciated. Brian let out a low whistle despite himself. "Wow." Sandy glanced at him. "Don't start." "I'm not starting. I'm observing. It's just a house." "It's several houses pretending to be one," Brian said. "You could lose a small civilization in there." She couldn't help laughing. "You're being dramatic." "I'm being accurate." The car slowed as they approached a long, curving driveway framed by neatly trimmed hedges. At the end of it, a large stone house came into view, all clean lines and quiet confidence, like it didn't need to show off because it already knew its value. Brian parked the car and turned off the engine. The sudden silence felt heavier than the motion. "Well," Sandy said, unbuckling her seatbelt. "This is it." "Yep." She reached for the door, then paused and looked at him. "Hey." He met her gaze. They're not going to decide your worth, she said softly. I already did. Brian held her eyes for a moment, then nodded. That's good, he said, because I'm not auditioning. Good, she repeated. They stepped out of the car, gravel crunching underfoot, and Brian took a slow breath of the crisp suburban air. I can do this, he murmured, mostly to himself. You can, Sandy said. And if it goes badly, it won't. If it does, he continued, we'll just go get burgers or something. Sandy smiled. Deal. They walked toward the front door together, her hand brushing against his before slipping into his. It grounded him in a way he hadn't expected. For a fleeting second, he let himself believe it might actually go smoothly. Then the door opened before they even had a chance to knock. A tall man stood there, posture straight, expression measured, as though he'd been waiting with a stopwatch. You must be Brian, he said. Brian offered a polite smile. That's me. Sandy squeezed his hand once, reassuring. Come in, her father said, stepping back to let them enter. His gaze lingered on Brian just a fraction too long, not unfriendly, but not warm, either. Brian stepped inside, taking in the polished floors, the high ceilings, the quiet kind of wealth that didn't need decoration to feel expensive. He felt that tightness in his chest again, sharper now. Not fear, he told himself, just context. And context, he knew, had a way of becoming confrontation sooner or later. Chapter 2. First impressions and quiet appraisals. If the exterior of the house had suggested restraint, the interior confirmed it. Everything inside Sandy's parents' home felt intentional in a way that made Brian acutely aware of his own lack of intention. The floors gleamed without looking polished, the furniture was arranged with mathematical precision, and even the air seemed curated, faintly citrus with something underneath that hinted at money without ever becoming obvious. It smells like a hotel, Brian murmured under his breath. Sandy elbowed him lightly. Be nice. I didn't say a bad hotel. Her father walked ahead of them through the entryway, not bothering to glance back to see if they were following. It wasn't quite rude, more like he assumed people would keep up. A man accustomed to being followed, Brian thought. Sandra. A woman's voice called from deeper in the house. Is that you? A woman appeared at the end of the hallway, her presence immediate and assured. She was elegantly dressed in a way that suggested she could have chosen comfort but had declined it, and her smile, though warm, felt practiced. Mom, Sandy said, her voice brightening. She stepped forward and embraced her. Brian watched the exchange carefully. It was affectionate, yes, but measured like everything else here. Sandy pulled back and gestured toward him. This is Brian. Her mother turned her attention to him, and for a split second, Brian had the distinct impression of being catalogued. Brian, she said, extending a hand. We've heard so much about you. That phrase again, he thought. It always meant something different depending on who said it. I hope it was at least partially accurate, Brian replied, shaking her hand. Her smile deepened just a fraction. We'll see. Sandy's father lingered nearby, arms loosely crossed, observing. Let's get settled, he said. We're having brunch on the terrace. Of course we are, Brian muttered, then quickly added. That sounds great. They moved through the house, past rooms that looked untouched and yet lived in at the same time, until they reached a set of wide glass doors that opened onto the back terrace. Brian blinked. The terrace overlooked a rolling stretch of land that seemed to exist purely for aesthetic purposes. Carefully landscaped greenery, a distant line of trees, and a hint of water catching the sunlight. The table itself was set with quiet elegance, polished silverware catching the light, glasses already filled with something sparkling. This is nice, Brian said. Thank you, Sandy's mother said. We spend a lot of time out here. I can see why, he replied. They took their seats, the arrangement subtle but telling. Sandy sat beside Brian, her father across from him, her mother at the head of the table. It took less than 30 seconds for Brian to understand the choreography of the space. This was not just brunch. This was positioning. A server, actual real, appeared briefly to set down a platter of food before disappearing again as silently as he'd come. Brian raised an eyebrow. You have staff. We have help, her mother corrected smoothly. Right, Brian said. There was a brief pause as they began to serve themselves, the quiet clink of cutlery filling the space. Sandy spoke first. The drive was good. No traffic. That's lucky, her mother said. Weekend traffic can be dreadful. Brian nodded. We only got stuck behind one tractor, so I'd call that a win. A tractor? Her father repeated. Yeah, it seemed emotionally invested in being in front of us, Brian said. Sandy pressed her lips together, trying not to smile. Her father did not smile. I see, he said, though it was clear he didn't. The conversation limped forward after that, polite and tentative. Sandy filled in gaps where she could, mentioning a recent trip, a mutual friend, anything that might smooth the edges. Brian answered questions when asked, careful but not rehearsed. So, her mother said after a few minutes, dabbing lightly at her lips, Sandy tells us you're a veterinarian. I am. That must be rewarding. It is, Brian said. Most of the time. And the rest of the time? Her father asked. It's messy, Brian said honestly. Animals don't understand what's happening to them, and people don't always make good decisions on their behalf. Her father regarded him for a moment. And you're comfortable making those decisions for them? I'm comfortable doing the best I can with what I know, Brian said. That's about all anyone can do. There was something in the way he said it that shifted the air slightly, though Brian couldn't quite name it. His mother leaned forward just a touch. And you've been in this profession how long? 7 years. So you're well established. I'm steady, Brian said. I wouldn't call it glamorous. Not everything needs to be glamorous, she said. No, he agreed. It doesn't. Sandy reached for his hand briefly under the table, a small grounding gesture. Brian squeezed back, appreciating it more than he let on. For a moment, things felt almost normal. Then Sandy's father set down his fork with deliberate care. Brian, he said, folding his hands loosely in front of him. Tell me, how do you see your relationship with my daughter? There it was. Brian wiped his hands on his napkin, buying himself a second. I see it as something I value, he said. We've been together 6 months. We're still learning each other. And where do you see it going? His father pressed. Sandy shifted slightly in her chair. Dad, no, it's fine, Brian said calmly. He met the man's gaze. I see it going forward, if that's what you're asking. That's vague. It's honest. Her father's expression sharpened just a fraction. Honesty is useful, but clarity is better. Sometimes clarity takes time, Brian replied. And sometimes, her father said, it's a matter of intent. The air thinned. Brian felt Sandy's hand tighten slightly around his. What exactly are you asking? He said. His father leaned back just enough to signal control without appearing aggressive. I'm asking what your long-term intentions are with my daughter. Brian held his gaze. My intention is to treat her well, he said. To build something real with her. Beyond that, I don't make promises I can't guarantee. There was a flicker of something. Approval? Disapproval? That passed too quickly to read. And what makes you think you're in a position to do that? Her father asked. Sandy inhaled sharply. Dad. But Brian didn't look at her. He was still watching the man across from him, and that tightness in his chest had begun to shift into something steadier. Not nerves, something closer to resolve. The conversation hadn't turned yet, not fully, but Brian could feel it approaching. A slow tilt in the balance of the room. The kind of moment that didn't repeat itself. The kind that always led somewhere decisive. Chapter 3. The line that gets crossed, the question lingered between them, heavy with implication. What makes you think you're in a position to do that? Brian didn't respond immediately. He picked up his glass instead, took a small sip, and placed it back down with deliberate care. It wasn't hesitation, it was control. He'd learned early in life that people like Sandy's father counted silence as weakness unless it was wielded properly. So he let the quiet stretch just long enough to register. Then he spoke. I don't think relationships are about position, Brian said evenly. I think they're about two people deciding they want to build something together. Her father's eyes narrowed slightly. That's an idealistic answer. It's a practical one, Brian countered. Anything else tends to fall apart. Sandy shifted in her seat, her gaze flicking between the two men, tension creeping into her posture. Her mother, meanwhile, had gone still, watchful, composed, almost curious. And what exactly do you have to offer my daughter? Her father asked. There it was. Not masked, not softened, just asked plain and cutting. Sandy's voice came out sharp this time. Dad, that's… Brian lifted a hand slightly, not looking at her. It's okay. But it wasn't, and he knew it. Still, he kept his attention forward. I offer her myself, Brian said. Same as she offers herself to me. That's not an answer, her father said. It's the only real one, Brian replied. Her father leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. His tone didn't rise, but it hardened. My daughter has been raised with a certain standard of living, a certain expectation of life, stability, opportunity, comfort. Do you believe you can provide that? Brian felt something click into place inside him. Not anger, not yet. Recognition. I think Sandy can provide that for herself, he said. She already does. That's not the point. It seems like exactly the point, Brian said. She's not something to be provided for. She's a person who chooses what she wants. Sandy's hand tightened around his again, this time not just grounding, but grateful. Her father didn't look at her. He didn't even acknowledge the gesture. And yet, he said, his voice sharpening, people don't exist in a vacuum. Choices have consequences. Pairing yourself with someone who cannot match your trajectory, financially, socially, limits those choices. There was a faint, almost imperceptible shift in Sandy's mother's expression at that. Something like disapproval. Brian noticed, but he kept his focus. So this is about money, he said. It's about reality. It's about money, Brian repeated. Her father didn't deny it. Instead, he leaned back again, settling into his chair with the quiet confidence of someone who believed the ground beneath him couldn't shift. Why do you think you're good enough for her? He asked. The words landed clean. No pretense now. No refinement. Just the question exactly as it was meant. Sandy's breath caught. Stop it. But Brian didn't move. He didn't flinch. For a moment, the world seemed to narrow to a single point, the space between him and the man across the table. And in that space, Brian felt something shift from restraint to certainty. He placed both hands flat on the table and slowly stood. The scrape of the chair against the stone floor was the loudest sound in the world for a second. Sandy looked up at him, startled. Brian, he didn't answer. Instead, he stepped around his chair and began walking. Not away, but toward her father. That was the moment everything changed. Her father's posture stiffened, his composure tightening, though he remained seated. He hadn't expected movement. That much was obvious. Brian stopped beside him, close enough that there was no longer any illusion of distance. Then he looked down at him. Up close, Sandy's father looked slightly older, slightly less untouchable. Brian let that register. Then he spoke. That's the problem with people with money, he said calmly. There was no raised voice, no overt aggression, but there was an edge clear and unmistakable. Her father blinked, caught off guard. I'm sorry. You think this is how conversations work, Brian continued. You think you can ask questions like that and everyone will just sit there and justify themselves to you. That's not what. Brian gave a small, humorless smile. Normally, he said, cutting him off, people are polite. Even when they don't like someone, they keep it to themselves. They give each other space. He leaned in just slightly, not threatening, but deliberate. But only wealthy people, he went on, are comfortable saying what you just said and assuming there won't be consequences. For the first time since the conversation began, Sandy's father looked genuinely unsettled. The shift was subtle but unmistakable. Brian held his gaze. You said that, Brian continued. Like I wouldn't get up, walk over here, and punch you in the face. The words hung there, stark and unadorned. Sandy inhaled sharply. Her mother went completely still. And her father's expression drained, just for a flicker of a second. Not fear exactly, but the sudden recognition of uncertainty, of a variable he hadn't accounted for. Brian straightened again, the tension in him settling back into something controlled. I'm not going to do that, he said evenly. But the fact that it didn't even cross your mind? That's the issue. Silence fell, thick and suffocating. No one moved. No one spoke. Brian let it sit there for exactly as long as it needed to. Then he turned. Sandy was still seated, frozen somewhere between shock and confusion. He met her eyes. I've seen enough, he said. Her lips parted, but no words came out. I'm going home, he added, calm and certain. The words landed just as firmly as anything he'd said to her father. If you want a ride, he continued, I'll be leaving in 15 minutes. The offer wasn't harsh. It wasn't pleading either. It was simple, open, final. He didn't wait for her answer. Instead, he turned and walked back toward the house, his footsteps even unhurried, leaving behind the perfectly arranged table, the untouched food, and the shattered illusion of a polite afternoon. Behind him, the silence broke, but whatever words followed, he didn't hear them, because for Brian, the moment was already over. The line had been crossed, and he had no intention of stepping back over it. Chapter 4. The 15 minutes inside the house, the silence felt different. It wasn't the curated, polished quiet of before. It was unsettled now, like something had cracked and the sound hadn't quite finished echoing. Brian moved through the hallway with the same steady pace he'd had outside, though now that he was alone, he let out a long breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Well, he muttered to himself, that escalated efficiently. He rubbed his face briefly, then headed toward the front room where they'd entered. Sandy had pointed out the guest room earlier in case you want to drop your bag, and he followed his memory of the hallway, turning left, then right. He found it easily. The space was immaculate. Of course it was. His bag sat untouched in the corner, looking vaguely out of place, like it had wandered in by accident. Brian crossed the room and crouched down, unzipping it with practiced efficiency. He folded his spare shirt, tucked it neatly, checked for his wallet and keys, small grounding routines, things he could control. Outside, faint voices filtered through the house. Sharp, then softer, then sharp again. He paused, listening for just a second. Sandy's voice, tight, defensive. Her father's lower, controlled but edged. Her mother's, interjecting, measured, trying to shape something that no longer wanted shaping. Brian exhaled again. Yeah, he muttered. That sounds about right. He slung the bag over his shoulder and glanced around the room one last time, as if confirming there was nothing of him left behind. Because there wouldn't be. Not like this. He stepped back into the hallway and began walking toward the front door. Halfway there, he stopped. For a moment, just a sliver of one, he considered waiting longer than 15 minutes. Giving more space. More time. But the thought didn't hold. Time wouldn't fix what had happened. Time would just make it easier for people to pretend it hadn't. Brian didn't have much interest in pretending. He continued on. Back on the terrace, things had not settled. Sandy stood now, arms crossed tightly over her chest. Her gaze locked onto her father with a mix of disbelief and anger. "I can't believe you said that to him," she said. "I asked a reasonable question," her father replied, though the earlier certainty in his tone had dimmed, just enough to notice. "You didn't," she shot back. "You interrogated him. I protected you." "From what?" she demanded. "A decent man who treats me better than anyone I've dated?" Her mother rose as well, placing a hand on the table as if to steady the conversation. "Let's all just take a breath." "No," Sandy said sharply. "No, we're not doing that. You don't get to smooth this over." Her father's jaw tightened. "You're being dramatic. And you're being arrogant." That landed. For a moment, no one spoke. Then, quieter, her mother said, "Sandy, your father is concerned about your future. And I'm concerned about people who think they get to dictate it," Sandy replied. Her father stood now too, pushing his chair back with controlled force. "I'm not dictating anything. I'm questioning." "No," she cut in. "You weren't asking. You were judging. There's a difference." "And what would you have me do?" he snapped, the composure finally slipping. "Sit here and say nothing while you attach yourself to someone who can't offer you the life you've been given?" Sandy stared at him, stunned. "Attach myself?" she repeated. Her mother winced just slightly. "He's not a downgrade," Sandy said, her voice low but shaking now. "He's not a step down from anything." "That's not what I said." "It's exactly what you said," she fired back. "You just dressed it up." Her father opened his mouth to respond, but whatever he was about to say got lost, because at that moment the back door opened. Brian stepped out onto the terrace again. Every conversation stopped. He stood there for a second, taking in the scene, the overturned rhythm, the tension still hanging thick in the air. "Well," he said lightly, though there was no real humor behind it. "This seems productive." Sandy turned toward him immediately, relief flashing across her face, followed quickly by uncertainty. "Brian, I'm heading out," he said, adjusting the strap of his bag. His tone was calm again, steady, like nothing inside him was unsettled anymore, which wasn't entirely true, but it was close enough. Her father watched him carefully now, the earlier confidence replaced by a more cautious awareness. "Before you go," he said, trying to regain some control, "I think we should—" "No," Brian said, not unkindly. "We shouldn't." The word landed clean. There was no aggression in it, just finality. "This isn't something that a few more sentences are going to fix," Brian continued. "And I don't think you actually want to fix it right now." Her father's expression tightened. "You're making assumptions." "I'm making observations," Brian said. That almost made Sandy laugh, despite everything. Her mother stepped forward slightly. "Brian," she said, her voice gentler now, "perhaps we got off on the wrong foot." "I don't think it was the foot that was the issue," Brian replied. A flicker of something, regret, maybe, passed through her eyes. He let that sit for a moment, then shifted his attention back to Sandy. "I meant what I said," he told her. "I'm leaving in a few minutes." The space between them felt suddenly very wide. "Okay," she said softly, but she didn't move. "Not yet." Brian nodded once, as if accepting that. "Take your time," he added. Then he turned again and started toward the side steps that led down to the driveway. Behind him, no one tried to stop him this time, because now they understood something they hadn't before, that Brian wasn't bluffing. And he wasn't staying to negotiate. The gravel crunched under his shoes as he reached his car. He unlocked it, tossed his bag into the back seat, and leaned against the door for a moment, staring out at the quiet stretch of the property. It really was beautiful, still, ordered, like nothing messy was allowed to exist here for very long. Brian let out a faint breath. "Yeah," he said to no one. "Definitely not my habitat." He checked his watch. 12 minutes. He didn't get in the car yet. Didn't start the engine. Because despite everything, he still meant what he'd said. He'd give her the time, the choice. Not because he needed her to come with him, but because it mattered that she had the option. So he stood there waiting, not anxious, not uncertain, just ready for whatever she decided. Chapter 5. The choice at the end of the driveway. Sandy didn't follow him immediately. She stood on the terrace long after Brian disappeared down the steps, the echo of his words lingering louder than anything else in the air. "I've seen enough." It had been calm, measured, not angry, not in the way she was used to seeing anger. That almost made it worse, because there had been certainty underneath it. Her father broke the silence first. "If he thinks that kind of behavior is acceptable, stop," Sandy said, her voice cutting through his with surprising sharpness. Both her parents looked at her. "No," she continued, shaking her head. "You don't get to do that. You don't get to pretend this is about his behavior." Her father's expression hardened again, reflexively. "He threatened me." "He didn't threaten you," she shot back. "He told you something you didn't expect to hear. There's a difference." "He implied violence. He implied consequence," Sandy said. "And honestly, you acted like there wouldn't be any." Her mother stepped forward, placing a gentle hand on Sandy's arm. "Sweetheart." "Mom, please," Sandy said, softer but no less firm. "Don't." She pulled her arm free and took a step back, creating distance. I brought someone I care about here, she said, her voice trembling now, not with hesitation, but with feeling. Someone I trust. And instead of getting to know him, she looked directly at her father, reduced him to what he earns and what he can provide. That matters, he insisted. It matters to you, she corrected. Not to me. It will, he said, quieter now. Eventually. Sandy let out a short, humorless breath. You don't get it. Then explain it to me, he challenged. She stared at him for a long moment. And in that moment, something shifted in her. Something subtle but irreversible. I don't need him to provide a life for me, she said slowly. I already have one. What I want is someone who shows up honestly. Someone who doesn't pretend. Someone who sees me as an equal, not as an investment. Her mother's face softened at that, but her father remained unmoved. And you think he's that person? He asked. I know he is, Sandy said. There was no hesitation this time. No uncertainty. Her father exhaled slowly, as though reining in something he didn't want to say outright. And what about the future? Sandy shook her head. You keep asking that like it's a contract I'm supposed to negotiate. It's not. She took a step back toward the house. I'm not choosing between lifestyles, she added. I'm choosing a person. Her father opened his mouth again, but she didn't wait to hear it, because for the first time, she realized something that had been quietly true for a long time. He wasn't going to understand this in the moment. Maybe not at all. And waiting for that understanding wasn't part of her decision. I'll be back later, she said, already turning. Sandy, her mother called after her. But Sandy didn't stop. Brian checked his watch again. 14 minutes. Good timing, he muttered. The house behind him remained quiet from this distance, the tension hidden again beneath distance and architecture. It almost looked peaceful. That, he thought, was part of the problem. He pushed himself off the car and reached for the door handle. Sandy! Her name carried faintly across the yard. Brian froze for half a second. Then he turned. She was coming down the steps quickly, not running, but close enough to it that intent was unmistakable. Her hair had come slightly loose, and her expression, focused, determined, felt far more real than anything he'd seen since they arrived. Brian waited, because now the moment belonged to her. She crossed the gravel and slowed as she reached him, catching her breath just slightly. You didn't start the car, she said. I said 15 minutes. She glanced at his watch. You're precise. I try to be, he said. There was a brief silence, not awkward, just full. I'm coming with you, she said. Brian studied her face, not questioning, but confirming. Okay, he said simply. She nodded once, as if sealing it. Then, after a beat, she let out a small breath and added, That was a lot. Yeah, Brian said. It was. They stood there for a moment longer, the tension draining into something quieter. You okay? He asked. Sandy considered the question. My father just tried to interrogate my boyfriend like he was applying for a position, she said. And my boyfriend implied he might punch my father. Hypothetically, Brian clarified. She huffed out a short laugh despite herself. Right? Hypothetically. So, he said, on a scale of 1 to we need ice cream immediately. Ice cream, she said. Yeah, Brian nodded. That feels right. Another small silence settled, lighter this time. Then Sandy looked at him, really looked, eyes searching, thoughtful. You didn't apologize, she said. Brian blinked. For what? For how that went. For what you said. He leaned back against the car slightly, considering. No, he said. I didn't. Most people, she knew, would have softened, smoothed it out, tried to repair things just enough to keep the peace. He hadn't. Do you regret it? She asked. Brian met her gaze directly. No, he said. Not defensive. Not stubborn. Just honest. Sandy let that settle. And strangely, it didn't make things harder. It made them clearer. Good, she said finally. That caught him off guard. Good. I don't either, she said. Brian's eyebrows lifted slightly. Well, that's either reassuring or a sign we're both terrible at conflict resolution. Or, Sandy said, stepping closer, we just don't like being talked down to. Also possible. She studied him for a moment longer, then smiled just a little. You really thought about punching him? A little. Brian. I didn't say I was going to, he said. Just that it occurred to me. She shook her head, amused despite everything. You're unbelievable. I've been told that. She reached for his hand again, this time without hesitation. Let's go, she said. Burgers? He asked. And ice cream, she added. Obviously. He opened the passenger door for her, and she slid into her seat, settling in like she belonged there. Not in the big house behind them, not in the carefully controlled world she'd grown up in, but here, with him. Brian walked around to the driver's side and got in. For a moment, he didn't start the engine. Instead, he looked up at the house one last time. There was no anger in it anymore. Just recognition. Not your habitat? Sandy said quietly. Brian smiled faintly. Not really. She nodded. Mine neither. Not like it used to be. That landed somewhere deeper than either of them expected. Brian started the car. The engine turned over smoothly, familiar and grounding. And as they pulled away from the driveway, neither of them looked back again. Chapter 6. Burgers, ice cream, and the space between. The diner wasn't remarkable. That was exactly why Brian liked it. It sat on the edge of a small town just off the highway, tucked between a gas station and a hardware store, the kind of place that didn't need to advertise itself because the people who came there already knew what they were getting. Consistency, honesty, food that didn't pretend to be anything else. Brian pulled into the gravel lot and cut the engine. This looks perfect, Sandy said, already unbuckling her seatbelt. It has good fries, Brian said. That's all I need. They stepped out of the car, the late afternoon sun warming the air just enough to take the edge off the earlier tension. The neon sign buzzed faintly above the door as they walked in. Inside, the smell hit them first: grease, salt, sugar, and something faintly nostalgic that Brian couldn't quite name. I feel better already, Sandy said. That's the goal. They slid into a booth near the window, the vinyl seat sticking just slightly as they settled in. A waitress with a tired smile and a pen tucked behind her ear appeared moments later. What can I get you? She asked. 2 burgers, Brian said, glancing at Sandy. With fries, Sandy added. And 2 milkshakes? Chocolate, Sandy said immediately. Vanilla, Brian said. Classic combo, the waitress said with a nod, scribbling it down. Be right back. As she walked away, Sandy leaned back in her seat and let out a long, slow breath. Okay, she said. Now I can think. Good, Brian said. Another quiet moment settled, not uncomfortable, just recalibrating. Sandy looked at him across the table, her expression softer now, more reflective. That really happened, she said. Yeah, Brian replied. My dad really said that. Yeah. And you really, she gestured vaguely, did that. Brian tilted his head, stood up, walked over, made a strong point. You told him you might punch him. I said he assumed I wouldn't, Brian corrected. Sandy laughed, shaking her head. You're impossible. I've been consistent about that. She leaned forward slightly, resting her arms on the table. I didn't know you had that in you. Brian frowned a little. That's concerning. No, I don't mean. She paused, searching. I mean, you're calm. You think things through. You don't explode. I didn't explode. You didn't, she agreed. But you didn't back down either. Brian considered that. I don't like being disrespected, he said. And I don't like when people assume I'll tolerate it quietly. Sandy nodded slowly. Most people would have. Most people aren't me. No, she said, a small smile forming. They're not. The waitress returned with their drinks, setting them down with practiced efficiency. The milkshakes were thick, the straws slightly bending as they pushed them in. Sandy took a sip immediately. Oh, that's good. Brian tasted his and nodded. Yeah. They both seemed to relax a little more after that. Something about being in a place that didn't demand performance easing the edges. A part of me, Sandy said after a moment, still wants to apologize for him. Brian shook his head. You don't need to. I know I don't need to, she said. But I still feel it. That makes sense, he said. He's your dad. She traced the rim of her glass with her finger. He wasn't always like that. Brian raised an eyebrow. No, he always cared about success, she said. But it used to be more about effort, building something. Somewhere along the way it turned into measuring everything. Brian nodded slowly. That happens, does it? Yeah, he said. People start thinking what they have is the same as what they are. Sandy let that sit for a second. That's exactly it, she said. Their food arrived then. 2 plates set down with a satisfying weight, the smell of fries cutting through everything else. Sandy picked one up immediately. Okay. Crisis officially downgraded. To what level? Manageable with carbs. Good, Brian said. They ate in comfortable silence for a few minutes, the simple act grounding them both. Then Sandy spoke again, quieter this time. I meant what I said back there, she said. Brian glanced up. About choosing a person, she said. Not a lifestyle. He studied her for a moment, gauging. I know, he said. And it matters, he admitted. She smiled faintly. Good. But, he added, setting his burger down. You don't have to prove anything to me either. I'm not, she said. I'm just being clear. Brian nodded. That's fair. There was a pause. Then Sandy leaned forward slightly, her eyes narrowing in a way that signaled a shift in tone. Be honest, she said. I usually am. How close were you really? She asked. To actually hitting him. Brian blinked. Seriously. Seriously. He leaned back, considering it with more thought than she probably expected. Not close, he said finally. Sandy raised an eyebrow. Okay, he amended. A little closer than I would have liked. She laughed despite herself. Brian. He pushed pretty hard. Brian said. But I knew I wasn't going to. That's not who I am. I know, she said. I just wanted him to realize that he doesn't get to assume things about people, Brian added. That sometimes there's pushback. Sandy nodded slowly. He definitely realized. They shared a look, one part humor, one part acknowledgement of the chaos they just left behind. Do you think I should go back tonight? She asked after a moment. Brian didn't answer immediately. I think that's your decision, he said. Not mine. I know, she said. But I want your perspective. He wiped his hands on a napkin and leaned forward slightly. I think if you go back, he said slowly, it should be because you want to talk to them, not because you feel like you have to fix something. Sandy considered that. That's a good distinction, she said. I try to make those. She smiled. You're good at them. Years of practice, he said. Another quiet moment passed, easier now. Sandy reached across the table and took his hand again. You didn't apologize, she said softly, echoing her earlier words. But this time it wasn't a question. Brian shook his head. No, I'm glad, she said. He squeezed her hand gently. Me too. Outside, a car passed by on the highway, the sound fading quickly into the background. Inside, everything felt steady again. Not perfect, not resolved, but real. And for both of them, that mattered more than anything they'd left behind. Chapter 7. The return call. They didn't rush back. After burgers and milkshakes turned into ice cream at a small roadside stand 2 blocks down, after the sharp edges of the day smoothed into something manageable, Brian drove them back toward the city at an unhurried pace. The sunset stretched across the horizon, turning the sky into bands of orange and fading blue, and for a while neither of them felt the need to interrupt it. Sandy had kicked her shoes off again, her feet resting lightly against the dashboard. One hand curled loosely in Brian's. I feel like I aged 5 years today, she said eventually. Only 5, Brian said. That seems optimistic. She huffed a small laugh. Okay, maybe 10. I think I broke even, he said. Stress cancels out with milkshakes. That's not how that works. That's how it works for me. She turned her head to look at him, her expression thoughtful. You're surprisingly okay. I wouldn't say surprisingly, he said. I've had worse days. Really? She asked. I once had a goat headbutt me into a fence while the owner insisted it was just playful, Brian said. That ranks higher on the chaos scale. Sandy smiled faintly. You compare my family to goats. I compare the situation, he corrected. Less headbutting, more verbal sparring. That's somehow worse. Debatable, he said. At least your dad wasn't aiming for my knees. She shook her head, amused in spite of everything. You're unreal. I've heard that. The car settled back into comfortable silence again, the earlier tension now something they could talk around instead of sitting inside. Then Sandy's phone buzzed. Once, twice. She glanced down at it, her expression shifting immediately. Dad? Brian asked. Mom, she said. She didn't pick it up right away. The phone buzzed again. Brian kept his eyes on the road. You don't have to answer. I know. But she picked it up anyway. She hesitated for a second, then swiped to accept the call. Hi, Mom. There was a pause, filled only by the faint sound of her mother's voice on the other end. Too quiet for Brian to make out words, but the tone was clear, careful, measured. Sandy stared out the window as she listened. No, she said after a moment. I'm not coming back right now. Another pause. I know, she replied, softer this time. I know he didn't mean to. No, actually, that's not true. He did mean it. That's the problem. Brian kept his expression neutral, not intruding, but fully aware of every shift in her voice. No, Sandy said again, firmer. I'm not mad at you. A longer pause. Then she sighed quietly. I just need some space before we talk about it, she said. There was a change in tone from the other end, firmer now, more insistent. Sandy's posture tensed. I'm not choosing against you, she said, her voice rising just slightly. I'm choosing what I'm okay with. Brian glanced over briefly, just enough to read the expression on her face. Frustration, but underneath it, resolve. I don't need him to come back and apologize tonight, she said. That's not the point. Another stretch of listening. Then softer again. I do love you. The words landed quietly, filling the space in the car in a way that didn't feel heavy. I'll call you tomorrow, she added. There was one final exchange, short, subdued, and then she ended the call. For a moment, she just held the phone in her hand, staring at it. Then she exhaled and set it down. Well, Brian said lightly, that sounded productive. Sandy let out a breath that turned into a small laugh. You're terrible at reading emotional nuance. No, I'm great at it, he said. I just choose not to acknowledge it directly. That's not better. It's efficient. She leaned her head back against the seat. She wants us to come back. Tonight. Brian raised an eyebrow. That seems ambitious. Yeah, Sandy said. Apparently we should clear the air. Brian considered that. Does the air feel clearable? He asked. She laughed softly. Not tonight. Then I think you made the right call. I think so too. She turned her head toward him again, studying his profile. You haven't asked me what I'm going to do, she said. I don't need to, Brian replied. Oh, she said. Why's that? Because you already decided, he said. Sandy blinked, surprised. Did I? She asked. Yeah, he said. Back at the house. She thought about that. The moment she'd turned away from her father. The way she'd walked down the steps. The certainty that had carried her across the driveway. I guess I did, she admitted. Brian nodded. You don't seem like someone who half decides things. That's a polite way of saying I'm stubborn. I was going to say decisive. I like that better, she said. Another quiet settled between them, warm this time. Then Sandy reached over and rested her hand on his arm. Thank you, she said. Brian glanced at her. For what? For not making it worse, she said. He smiled faintly. That's a low bar. You could have, she insisted. You had every reason to. I didn't want to, he said. Why not? He shrugged slightly. Because then it turns into something else, something uglier. And I don't think that helps anyone. Sandy watched him closely. You're very good at knowing where the line is, she said. Not always, he admitted. Today was close, but you stayed on the right side of it, she said. He considered that. Yeah, he said. I did. She squeezed his arm lightly. I'm glad. The city lights began to appear in the distance, familiar and grounding. Home in its own imperfect way. So, Brian said after a moment, shifting the tone just slightly, do we want to classify today as a success or a disaster? Sandy smiled. Both, she said. Fair, he replied. She leaned her head gently against the window, watching the lights draw closer. You know what the weird part is? She said. What? I don't feel shaken, she said slowly. I feel clearer. Brian nodded. That makes sense. Does it? Yeah, he said. Clarity usually costs something. Today was just the price. Sandy let that sit. Then she smiled, small but real. Worth it, she said. Brian glanced at her, a flicker of something warmer in his expression. Yeah, he said. Probably. They drove the rest of the way in comfortable silence. Not because there was nothing left to say, but because, for the first time since that terrace, everything that mattered already had been. Chapter 8. What comes next? The city met them quietly. Not with fanfare or demand, but with familiar streets, uneven sidewalks, and the soft glow of storefronts that had already begun closing for the night. It felt grounding in a way that Sandy hadn't fully appreciated before. Not perfect, not polished, but honest. Brian pulled up in front of her apartment building and let the car idle for a moment. Neither of them moved to get out. Well, he said, glancing at her. This is the part where we pretend today was normal. Sandy smiled faintly. Was it not? I usually don't threaten violence before brunch, he said. Hypothetical violence, she corrected. Important distinction. She turned toward him in her seat, one knee tucked underneath her, studying him with an expression that was no longer uncertain or shaken, just clear. I don't want this to be weird, she said. Brian raised an eyebrow. The day? Or us? Us, she said. He nodded slowly. Okay. I mean it, she added. I don't want today to turn into something that changes what we have. Brian considered that carefully before answering. I don't think it does, he said. You don't? No, he said. If anything, it clarified a few things. Like what? He leaned back slightly in his seat, one hand resting on the steering wheel, the other relaxed in his lap. Like how you handle pressure, he said. How you make decisions. What actually matters to you when it counts. Sandy's expression softened. And I liked what I saw, he said simply. That hit her harder than she expected. Good, she said quietly. What about you? He asked. Did today change anything for you? Sandy didn't answer immediately. Instead, she reached out and rested her hand on his arm again, thoughtful. It didn't change how I feel about you, she said. That part's easy. Brian nodded once, waiting. But it did change something else, she continued. He watched her, steady. It made me realize I've been letting two versions of my life exist at the same time, she said. The one I want, and the one I inherited. That's a heavy thing to realize over brunch, Brian said lightly. She smiled faintly. Yeah, your timing's terrible. I've heard that before. But it's not a bad thing, she went on. It just means I can't pretend those two things don't clash anymore. Brian nodded slowly. That sounds right. And I don't want to choose the easier one, she added. He studied her face for a moment, searching for any hesitation. There wasn't any. Okay, he said. That's it? She asked. That's a big decision, Brian said. It doesn't need a big reaction. Sandy laughed softly. You're very calm about life-altering realizations. I deal with animals who panic at shadows, he said. I've learned that staying calm helps. That's not the same thing. It's close enough. She leaned her head back and looked up through the windshield, watching the faint glow of the streetlights above. My mom's going to call again tomorrow, she said. Probably. And my dad will eventually want to talk. Definitely. She let out a breath. That's going to be something. Brian nodded. Yeah. Are you going to avoid him forever? She asked, glancing at him again. He considered it for a moment. No, he said. I don't avoid people. But you're not going to smooth things over either. No, he said. I'm not. Sandy smiled slightly. Consistent. Always. Good, she said. There was another pause. Not uncomfortable. Just full. Then Sandy reached for the door handle and stopped. Hey, she said. Brian looked at her. Today could have gone a lot worse, she said. He raised an eyebrow. That's optimistic. It could have, she insisted. You could have actually hit him. True, Brian said thoughtfully. That would have complicated things. Or I could have stayed, she said. Pretended everything was fine. Smiled through it. Brian shook his head slightly. That wouldn't have been you. It used to be, she said. He met her eyes. But it's not anymore, she added. There it was. Not a dramatic declaration. Not something meant to impress. Just a simple truth spoken clearly. Brian smiled, this time genuinely. Good, he said. Sandy studied him for one last moment, then leaned over the center console and kissed him. It wasn't rushed. Or tentative. It was steady, grounding. Like everything else about the day had finally settled into place. When she pulled back, there was a quiet certainty in her expression that hadn't been there that morning. I'll call you tomorrow, she said. I'll be around, Brian replied. Of course you will, she said, smiling. She opened the door and stepped out, pausing for just a second before closing it behind her. The cool evening air wrapped around her as she stood on the sidewalk, looking back at him through the open window. Drive safe, she said. Always do. She hesitated, just once, then nodded and turned, walking toward her building without looking back. Brian watched her go until the door closed behind her. Then he sat there for a moment, not replaying the day, not analyzing it, just acknowledging it. Yeah, he said quietly to himself. That happened. He let out a small breath, then started the engine. As he pulled away from the curb, the weight of the day didn't follow him the way he'd expected it might. Because for all its tension, for all its confrontation, nothing essential had been lost. Something had been revealed instead. And that, Brian thought, was usually more useful. The city unfolded around him as he drove, familiar and imperfect, exactly the way he liked it. No pretense, no performance, just forward. And for the first time since the terrace, Brian allowed himself a small, private smile. Because whatever came next, conversations, consequences, maybe even another round with her father, he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going to have that moment again. He wouldn't need to. It had already done its job. And now, like everything else in his life, it was simply part of the road ahead.